Today, we're digging into Chris Harman's A People's History of the World. Now, this is a book that completely flips the script on how we usually look at the past. Instead of just focusing on kings, queens, and empires, it tells the story of humanity from the ground up, through the eyes of ordinary people. So let's dive into this completely different way of seeing history.
Okay, so to really get to the heart of this book, we have to start by questioning how history is normally told. The author doesn't kick things off with a date or a famous battle. Nope. He starts with a simple but really powerful poem that challenges pretty much everything we think we know.
And right away, this quote just nails the central problem, doesn't it? Our history books are absolutely filled with the names of rulers, generals, the so-called great men who get all the credit for every major achievement. But is that really the whole story?
And here's the question that flips it all on its head. The poem forces us to stop and ask, what about everyone else? What about the millions of unnamed builders, the farmers, the cooks whose labor actually built the monuments and kept civilizations running? This is the side of history that almost always gets ignored.
So, if history isn't just a list of biographies of powerful people, then what is it? Well, Harman's book puts forward a totally different theory, a different engine that's been driving the story of humanity forward all this time.
And this is where we see that huge shift in perspective. It literally moves the camera from the palaces of the powerful down to the fields and the workshops where ordinary people lived and worked. The argument here is that the real story of history, it's found in the lives of the vast majority and in the ongoing struggles over how society gets organized.
Now, the core theory that drives this entire view, and this is a really key term to get, is historical materialism. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It basically says that if you want to understand a society's laws, its politics, or its culture, you first have to understand how its people produce the things they need to live. Food, shelter, tools. That economic base is like the skeleton that gives shape to everything else.
Okay, so once you have this framework, you start to see this incredible pattern emerge, something the book argues repeats itself again and again, all throughout thousands of years of human history.
So in this view, history doesn't just move in a nice straight line. It's more of a cycle. It goes something like this. A new way of producing things comes along, some kind of innovation. This gives power to a new group, a new social class. For a while, this class is revolutionary and it pushes society forward. But eventually, their own interests start to get in the way of more change. They become a barrier, and that leads to crisis, which sets the stage for the next big upheaval.
And this isn't just theory, right? We see this pattern play out in actual history. A key event the book points to is the collapse of civilizations like the Mayans. The argument is that the ruling class got so obsessed with building these grand temples that they pushed their whole agricultural system to the absolute breaking point. They became a roadblock to progress, used up all the resources, and it led to a total collapse.
All right, so with this powerful framework in hand, the author then turns his attention to challenging a couple of huge, incredibly common myths about who we are and where we're all headed.
First up is this big one, the idea that humans are just naturally selfish. But from this perspective, that's getting it completely backward. The book argues our behavior isn't fixed, it's shaped by the society we live in. For most of our existence, humans actually lived in highly cooperative groups. Greed isn't our default setting, it's the result of very specific historical conditions.
The second myth is the idea that we've kind of reached the finish line with modern capitalism, that this is the end of history. But the book puts this in perspective. It points out just how recent the system is. It's been around for less than half of 1% of all of human history. A tiny, tiny blip. Given that constant cycle of change we've seen, why on earth would we assume this brand new system is the one that lasts forever?
So you might be wondering, what's the point of all this? Why does looking at history from below and seeing it as this constant process of change matter to us right now? The book's conclusion gives a really powerful answer.
This famous line from George Orwell really gets to the heart of why this all matters. Our understanding of the past isn't just some academic exercise. It's a battleground. How we see what came before us directly shapes what we believe is possible for the future.
I mean, think about it. If history is just a story of great men doing great things and nothing ever really changes, then the future feels kind of locked in, right? But if it's a story of constant transformation, driven by the struggles of ordinary people, then suddenly the future's wide open. Understanding that historical pattern is the key to figuring out how we can shape what comes next.
And that leaves us with a final, really powerful thought to chew on.
If this book is right, if the real engine of historical change has always been the collective action of everyday people, then what does that say about our own lives, right here, right now? It suggests that history isn't something that just happens to us, it's something we make. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're looking at a book that doesn't just tell you about history, pretty much flips it on its head. It asks this really powerful question that changes everything. Whose story actually gets told, and maybe more importantly, who gets left out?
The source material kicks off with this amazing poem from Bertolt Brecht, and wow, it gets right to the heart of the matter. We all know the names of kings, emperors, presidents, but who actually built their monuments? I mean, really, who fought their wars? Who cooked their victory feasts? This whole perspective argues that if history is the story of how we got to right now, we've been reading a version with most of the main characters completely missing.
So to really get the alternative this book is proposing, we first have to talk about the version of history it's arguing against. You might have heard it called the great man theory of history, and it's probably the version a lot of us grew up with in school.
Right, this conventional story, it's like a highlight reel of the powerful. It's a story all about dynasties, elections, and military campaigns. The source even calls it a Trivial Pursuits version of history. You know, just a collection of names and dates to memorize, where a few supposedly great individuals get all the credit for shaping the entire world.
And when you put them side by side, the contrast is, well, it's stark. On one side, you've got the view from the palace, and on the other, you have the view from the fields and the factories. Instead of just focusing on the laws passed by parliaments, this alternative way of looking at history looks at the economic conditions and mass movements that force those laws to be written in the first place.
So if great men aren't the ones driving history, then what is? Well, drawing on the work of thinkers like Karl Marx, the book puts forward a completely different engine for historical change, and it's one that starts not with politics, but with the real basics of human survival.
And this is where our whole frame of reference really shifts. The first key concept is what's called the forces of production. It sounds complicated, but it's really just how a society makes a living. You know, its tools, its technology, and how people work together to produce everything they need. This is the foundation of, well, everything else.
And those forces of production, they give rise to the second big idea, the relations of production. See, the way a society produces things actually shapes the relationships between people. A society based on huge farms with simple tools, that might create the relationship of a slave and an owner, or a serf and a lord. These aren't just random social structures, they grow directly out of that economic base.
So here it is, the crucial point. According to this theory, the tension and the conflict between these different groups, the slave and the owner, the worker and the boss, that is the real engine of history. History isn't some smooth, orderly line of progress. No, it's a story of struggle, where changes in how we make stuff create new social groups, which leads to conflicts that literally push society into its next stage.
Now, it's one thing to have a theory, right? But what does this actually look like in practice? Well, the book re-examines some of the biggest turning points in history, like the Great Revolutions, through this very different lens.
Let's take the French Revolution. In the traditional story, we hear a ton about figures like Robespierre or Danton, but a people's history zooms in on the turning points that were driven by the masses. It wasn't some political assembly that took the Bastille, it was the Parisian crowd. It was a march of women from the city's poorest neighborhoods that dragged the king back to Paris. The source argues that at every single critical moment, it was the action of ordinary people that shoved the revolution forward.
And hey, this pattern wasn't just in France. The book makes a really similar case for the American Revolution. While we always learn about the Founding Fathers, this perspective puts the spotlight on the crucial role of popular committees made up of artisans and farmers. This quote here really drives that point home, connecting these grassroots groups as the real, shared engine of revolutionary change across different centuries and countries.
Okay, so this brings us to the final part of the argument, and honestly, maybe the most important part. Why does any of this matter? Why does it matter how we tell the story of the past? Because the way we see the past has huge implications for how we see our present and our future. The source material pulls out this famous line from George Orwell. Think about it. If history is always presented as the story of a few powerful people, it sends a clear message. Change comes from the top down, and the job of ordinary folks is just to follow along. But if history is a story of mass struggle from below, it suggests that ordinary people actually have the power to shape their own world. The narrative itself becomes a political battleground.
This entire view of history is a direct challenge to a pretty popular idea from a few decades ago, spelled out by Francis Fukuyama as the end of history.
The basic argument was that the big ideological struggles were finally over, that liberal, capitalist democracy was the final, settled form of human government. That's it, we're done.
But the book's response to that is to just ask us to zoom out, way out. Modern humans have been around for over 100,000 years. Industrial capitalism as a global system has only existed for about 250 of those years. From this perspective, the idea that this tiny, brief moment represents the permanent, final stage of all human history seems, well, maybe a little premature.
So we're left with this really provocative thought. If history is this turbulent story of conflict, driven by the collective actions of millions of people, why on earth would that whole process just suddenly stop now? The book forces us to ask, if the world has been turned upside down so many times before, has it really settled for good this time?
You know, when you walk into a grand museum or like flip through a standard history textbook, there is a very specific story being told.
Oh, absolutely.
You see these towering marble statues of emperors and grand lists of kings, dates of epic battles.
Like ruins of massive palaces.
Exactly. It's presented as this neat, linear highlight reel of human achievement.
Right. It's the classic great man theory of history. The idea that civilization is pushed forward by just a few exceptional individuals at the top, while the rest of humanity is just sort of there, like background extras.
But that ignores a massive, glaring question. I mean, the poet Bertolt Brecht actually captured this perfectly in a poem where he asked, who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books, you will find the names of kings. But did the kings haul up the lumps of rock?
Yeah, when the Great Wall of China was finished, where did the Masons go the next morning?
Right. So today, our mission on this deep dive is to completely rethink the story of humanity. We are test driving the framework from Chris Harman's A People's History of the World.
And it is a phenomenal text for really shifting your perspective. Instead of looking at top-down decrees, it looks at the interconnected why of history from the ground up.
Like, why did we build states?
Exactly. Why did social classes emerge? How did the everyday ways our ancestors secured their food and shelter completely rewire human society?
And for you listening, think of this deep dive as your shortcut to being deeply well-informed about the grand sweep of human history without, getting bogged down in an audio textbook.
It's a very different way of looking at things.
It is. And just a quick note here, we are looking at history through Harman's very specific, provocative lens of class struggle and material conditions today. Our goal isn't to tell you what politics to believe or to personally endorse this worldview, but we are objectively reporting on this analytical framework to see how it alters the way we view the past.
I think that's the best way to approach it. We're exploring the mechanics of his argument, which provides a really structured way to look at how human societies evolve based entirely on how they survive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the beginning, or at least what popular culture tells us is the beginning, the caveman myth.
Right, the Flintstones caricature.
Yeah. We all have this ingrained image of early humans as inherently greedy, aggressive, and, highly competitive. The whole idea that human nature is nasty, brutish, and short, and we need civilization to keep our savage instincts in check.
And that is probably the most pervasive myth this framework dismantles.
Yeah.
The archaeological and anthropological evidence completely contradicts that. I mean, for roughly 95% of our species' existence, that's over 100,000 years, humans lived as nomadic foragers.
Wow, 95%.
Yeah, and the defining characteristic of these societies wasn't brutal dog-eat-dog competition. It was fierce, uncompromising egalitarianism.
I found the studies on this fascinating, particularly the work by anthropologist Richard Lee. He spent time with the Kung people of the Kalahari, and the way they operate is a total inversion of modern corporate culture.
It really is.
Food is always shared. There are no rulers. And there is a specific social mechanism they use to prevent anyone from thinking they are the boss.
The meat mocking.
Yes. If a hunter brings back a huge kill, they don't get a medal or a promotion. If they start acting even slightly arrogant, the rest of the group actively cuts them down to size. They literally mock the meat, complaining that it's too skinny or tough, specifically to keep that hunter humble.
Because the social premium was entirely on cooperation. And that wasn't because early humans were just morally superior or enlightened. It was a mechanical requirement for survival.
Right, you couldn't survive alone.
Exactly. Survival operated on a strict system of mutual debt and sharing.
Yeah.
You didn't survive a harsh winter by hoarding. You survived because if you didn't catch anything today, someone else in the band who had a lucky hunt would share with you.
A hoarder in a nomadic band is a liability.
Precisely.
And, crucially, this era lacked the systemic oppression of women that we later see in class-based societies. Which makes sense when you look at how calories were actually acquired. We always hear about, man the hunter, but...
But the gathering provided the bulk of the food.
Right. The gathering of nuts, roots, and berries, which was primarily done by women, provided the most reliable source of daily calories. It was much more consistent than hunting large game.
And because women's labor was absolutely central to the group's survival, they held tremendous social power. Furthermore, childcare in a nomadic band required mobility and collective effort. You couldn't just, lock someone in a house.
Yeah, that doesn't work when you're moving every few weeks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because of this dynamic, decision-making was shared. Men and women decided together when to move camp. Partnerships were loose enough that people could separate without facing economic ruin because the whole band supported everyone.
That's incredible.
We are talking about tens of thousands of years of society without bosses, without a state, and without patriarchy.
Okay, to put that 100,000-year stretch into perspective, let's use an analogy. Imagine human history as a 24-hour clock. We are living in these completely cooperative, egalitarian bands for almost the entire day. Inequality and war. They only show up at 11:05 p.m.
A tiny fraction of our history.
So the obvious puzzle here is, if we were so cooperative, why did we ever stop? We didn't just wake up one Tuesday with a biological mutation that made us greedy, right?
No, absolutely not. The framework argues that human nature is highly flexible. It adapts directly to material conditions. Back then, survival required altruism. What destroyed this egalitarian setup was an environmental trigger, a shift in the global climate.
That ice age ending.
Right. About 10,000 years ago, conditions in the Fertile Crescent became drier and cooler. The wild herds dwindled. The wild grains dried up. The foragers faced an existential crisis. They couldn't just keep walking to find more food.
Because there was nowhere to go.
Exactly. They either had to starve, scatter, or find a way to manipulate nature itself.
And they chose to manipulate nature. They stayed in one place, planted seeds, and domesticated animals. The Neolithic trap. The agricultural revolution.
But the moment you settle and farm, the mechanics of survival completely change. You have to stay in one place to tend the crops. You are no longer moving away from waste or conflict.
Right.
And most importantly, you have to produce a surplus of grain. If you don't grow more than you can eat right now, you won't survive the winter or a year of bad harvests.
Which means you have to store it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And once you have a physical surplus of food, you need a way to store it safely from rot and rodents, and critically, you need people to manage that storage.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because there is a dark irony here. You would naturally assume that figuring out how to farm and store food would make everyone's life easier and more secure.
You'd think so.
But working harder at farming actually made life physically worse for the average person compared to foraging. Their diets became less diverse, their bones show more signs of repetitive stress, and suddenly they are tied to a single piece of dirt.
What's fascinating here is how a class that emerged as a necessary spur to production eventually became a parasitic fetter on it. The psychological and social shift that comes with a stored surplus is profound.
How so?
Well, think about the people managing the grain storehouses. Initially, they were performing a vital public service. They were protecting the community from famine, calculating the seasons, distributing the seeds.
They were just doing the math.
Right. But over generations, the architecture itself tells the story. Those simple mud brick storehouses gradually grew larger and more elaborate until they became the first temples. And those managers calculating the grain distributions became the first priests and rulers. The archaeologist Gordon Childe called this the urban revolution.
So the person with the key to the granary suddenly realizes they have power over everyone who needs to eat.
Precisely. The creation of a surplus fundamentally changed their motivation. To protect society from famine and to protect their own comfortable new status, these leaders realized they had to force the masses to keep working.
Even if the farmers were exhausted.
Even when they had enough for themselves. They had to keep producing for the central storehouse.
The transition is stark. I mean, Harman brings up an ancient tablet from Eshnunna in Mesopotamia. It's not a poem or a myth. It's a ledger listing 205 slave girls and children working in a centralized weaving establishment.
It's a massive shift.
In just a few thousand years, we've gone from egalitarian bands mocking the meat to keep people humble to institutionalized slavery logged on clay tablets.
And alongside the birth of this class system comes what's been called the world historic defeat of the female sex.
Right, because farming changed.
Exactly. As agriculture moved from simple hoe farming, which women actively participated in alongside gathering, to heavy plow agriculture and cattle herding, the physical demands changed entirely. Dragging a massive wooden plow through dense soil required immense upper body strength.
And logistically, you can't easily drag a heavy plow behind an ox while carrying or nursing an infant, but you could forage with one.
Exactly. Because the farming families needed more labor to work these larger, heavier fields, women were pressured to bear more children. They were pushed out of primary agricultural production and into the domestic sphere,
To focus on reproduction.
and processing the food the men brought in. Because men controlled the primary production, they controlled the surplus. Women became economic dependents in a patriarchal household.
So the patriarchy wasn't driven by, like, innate malice.
No, it was a structural byproduct of the new agricultural economy's physical and reproductive demands.
So once these local rulers solidified their control over the grain, the labor, and the social hierarchy, the logical next step was expansion. They needed more land and more bodies to generate an even bigger surplus, which leads us to the great ancient empires.
Rome, Egypt, China.
Yeah. When we picture them today, we imagine grand philosophy, towering aqueducts, pristine pyramids, but the reality on the ground was built on levels of exploitation that are almost hard to fathom.
The scale of human suffering was staggering. In the Roman Empire, at its height, there were some 2 million slaves.
2 million.
Yes. In China, destitute peasants were routinely forced to hand over up to half of their entire harvest to landlords and tax collectors. And if you lived in the city of Rome and you weren't part of the elite patrician class, you weren't lounging in a villa.
You were in the slums.
You were likely crammed into insulae,
Yeah.
these wooden tenements towering 60 to 70 feet high. They were structurally unsound, constantly catching fire, and had absolutely no sewers or running water.
It's horrifying. And there is a massive economic trap hidden inside this system of extreme inequality, right? Because the ruling elite had unlimited access to incredibly cheap human labor, either through those millions of slaves or utterly destitute peasants. They had zero incentive to invent labor-saving technology.
That is the crucial insight into why ancient empires eventually stagnated. Why would a Roman aristocrat spend a fortune trying to engineer a complex machine to grind grain or move rocks when they could just buy 100 humans to push a giant wheel?
It's like a massive modern monopoly buying up all the innovative startups just to shut them down because they don't want to bother upgrading their own product.
It's a perfect analogy. An elite class hoarding all the wealth and relying on forced labor actually halts human progress. The Roman Empire, for all its military glory, added virtually nothing to humanity's technological stock compared to the early agriculturalists or the later Chinese dynasties.
Wait, really? Nothing.
Very little. They knew about the water wheel, for example, but they used it very sparingly for centuries. It was simply easier and cheaper for the elite to manage slave labor than to invest in engineering.
But eventually, that lack of innovation catches up with you. If your population grows or the climate shifts again and your farming tech hasn't improved in 300 years, there simply isn't enough food.
And when a crisis hits a stagnant economy, the civilization becomes incredibly fragile. The elite really only have one response. They can't magically invent new technology overnight, so the only way to survive is to squeeze the poor even harder.
Which inevitably ignites the powder keg of rebellion. Did the people at the bottom ever realize what was happening and fight back?
Oh, brutally and frequently. History is littered with immense class wars that usually get glossed over. In Rome, during the 2nd century BC, you had the Gracchus brothers.
Tiberius and Gaius.
Right, they were actually from the elite, but they looked around and saw the total impoverishment of the Roman peasantry. Veterans were returning from wars to find their small farms bought up by wealthy aristocrats using slave labor. The brothers tried to pass moderate laws to distribute public land back to the poor.
And the Roman Senate's response to this call for moderate reform was completely unhinged. They literally tore up the wooden benches in the Senate House and clubbed Tiberius to death in the streets.
Yeah, and a decade later they used armed mercenaries to murder Gaius and 3,000 of his supporters.
Just brutal.
In China, the dynamic was similar but played out in massive cyclical peasant revolts. The Yellow Turbans, for instance. They were a massive messianic movement in the 2nd century AD, organizing hundreds of thousands of armed peasants who were entirely fed up with the crippling taxes of the Han Dynasty landlords.
And then there's Spartacus, the famous gladiator who broke out of a training camp and led an army of up to 70,000 slaves up and down the Italian peninsula, just repeatedly defeating Roman legions.
But here's the tragedy at the core of all these uprisings. Even when these massive rebellions won battles, they structurally failed to build a new kind of society.
Because they couldn't envision a new economic system.
Exactly. The peasants in China would successfully overthrow a corrupt, oppressive emperor, only to put a new rebel leader on the throne who would eventually oppress them just as badly a generation later.
Why couldn't they change the system itself?
The mechanics of their daily lives made true revolution almost impossible. A peasant's entire livelihood was inextricably tied to their specific plot of land. They couldn't leave their farms for a multi-year political campaign without their families starving.
That makes sense.
And more importantly, they couldn't coordinate a complex new economic system across an empire spanning thousands of miles. They lacked a vision for a different type of society. They just wanted a fairer version of the current one, lower taxes and a kinder king.
And the slaves faced a different but equally insurmountable hurdle, right? Spartacus's army was made up of people from a dozen different conquered cultures.
Right, they spoke different languages.
They had no shared model for how to run an integrated economy other than the vast, brutal Roman system that had enslaved them in the first place. I mean, you can burn down the plantations, but if you don't have an alternative economic system ready to implement, the old structures just rebuild themselves.
That's exactly it.
Right.
So if physical liberation in this world was impossible because of these logistical hurdles, the oppressed urban masses and the rural poor had to look somewhere else for relief. They turned to ideological liberation.
Religion.
Yes. This is the material context for the rise of universal religions.
So what does this all mean? I want to push back a little here because it's really easy to adopt a purely cynical view that religion is just a top-down trick invented by the elite to keep the masses docile.
Oh, it definitely didn't start that way.
Right. Early on, these movements were entirely grassroots. They weren't top-down tricks. They started as deep, authentic expressions of hope, mutual aid, and community for people who were living in the absolutely horrific conditions of ancient, overcrowded cities.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they absolutely provided genuine social safety nets when the state offered none. Christianity, for example, didn't start as the religion of emperors and palaces. It arose among the urban poor, the artisans, the marginalized fringes of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, during plagues or famines, the early Christian communities were often the only ones organized enough to care for the sick and distribute food.
And the early texts reflect this class dynamic. The Gospel of Luke is filled with intense hostility toward the rich, promising a future where the high and mighty would be pulled down from their thrones.
But the empire's initial response was to throw them to the lions.
Literally. But eventually, the empire strikes back by essentially joining them. By the 4th century, the Roman state under Constantine realized that 300 years of persecution hadn't crushed Christianity.
It was too deeply embedded.
Exactly. So the state absorbed it. The emperor became the patron of the church. A subversive underground movement of the urban poor was systematically transformed into the official shadow bureaucracy of the Roman Empire.
Complete with wealthy bishops and state-enforced doctrine telling the poor to obey their earthly masters. And the framework points out a similar ideological rigidification happening in India around the same time, specifically regarding Hinduism and the veneration of the cow.
Right, the mechanics of agriculture in India dictated a unique path. The heavy plow required cattle for motive power. During times of famine, there was an intense temptation for a starving peasant to eat their ox.
But if you eat your ox, you can't plow your field next year.
Which guarantees you will starve later. So Hinduism evolved to strictly protect the cow, turning a biological agricultural necessity into an absolute religious taboo.
Wow.
Simultaneously, the religion rigidified the caste system, locking cultivators, laborers, and priests into strict social strata to ensure the complex agricultural economy kept functioning without disruption.
It's an incredible, sweeping journey we've just been on. I mean, we started with 100,000 years of egalitarian foraging, where sharing was the only way to survive. Then a climate-induced shift dropped our ancestors into the trap of agriculture, forcing them to produce massive surpluses that gave birth to rulers, grain managers turned priests, and the structural defeat of women.
The domino effect.
Yeah. We saw how those local hierarchies mutated into massive, technologically stagnant empires built on the backs of slaves, leading to cyclical rebellions. And when those rebellions structurally failed to build a new world, the masses cried out for help through the birth of world religions, which were eventually co-opted by the very empires they emerged to escape.
It really is a profound reframing. It moves us away from memorizing dates and kings and forces us to look at the invisible architecture of human survival.
And for you, the listener, the reason this deep dive matters is immensely personal. The greed, the hyper-competitiveness, the rigid corporate hierarchies, the stress you experience navigating the modern world, they are not permanent biological fixtures of your DNA.
Absolutely not.
You are not a greedy caveman by nature. Those behaviors are just inherited responses to the specific ways our ancestors ended up organizing their economies over the last few thousand years. If we were cooperative for 95% of our history, that capacity is still in us.
And that raises perhaps the most important question of all, and it's a mind-bending thought to leave you with.
Let's hear it.
The core thesis here is that human nature dramatically changes whenever our primary method of survival, the way we produce our livelihood, changes. We shifted from egalitarian to hierarchical when we went from foraging to farming. Well, look at where we are today. Humanity is standing on the brink of another massive shift in how we produce our livelihood, driven by artificial intelligence, robotics, and unprecedented automation. We're completely changing the mechanics of labor.
Oh, wow.
When that transition is complete, what will the next version of human nature look like? Will we use these tools to invent terrifying new forms of extreme, unbreakable hierarchy? Or will we use this new technological abundance to finally return to the cooperative, egalitarian roots of our earliest ancestors?
That is the ultimate question. We are no longer hauling the lumps of rock for the kings of Thebes, but we are still writing the story of how we survived together. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning the world around you. So, for like 95% of human history, if you worked exceptionally hard, acquired some extra food, and then just hoarded it for yourself, your community wouldn't exactly call you successful.
Or definitely not. They wouldn't celebrate you at all.
Right. They wouldn't put you on a magazine cover or, praise your entrepreneurial spirit. They would actually mercilessly mock you.
Yeah, they'd insult your achievements and basically treat you like a literal threat to their survival.
It's wild to think about. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, we are entirely deconstructing this whole narrative of human nature and the way we understand how the modern world was actually built.
Because we do this thing where we tend to project our current economic and social anxieties backward, right? We just assume humanity has always operated as this like hyper-competitive race for resources.
Yeah, we like to think of history as this very linear, manageable parade of, visionaries making deliberate choices. Think about the history you were probably taught in school.
Oh, the classic dates and battles.
Exactly. It was mostly a chronological list of dates, kings, decisive battles, and this relentless march of great men who supposedly shaped the globe single-handedly.
Like, just because a king decided to conquer a neighbor or an emperor commanded a wall to be built, the whole world changed.
Right. It's clean, it's categorized, and it completely ignores the billions of ordinary humans who actually lived, worked, and survived through those eras. Which brings us to the source material we are unpacking today.
Yes. Today we are diving into excerpts from Chris Harman's book, A People's History of the World. And to set the foundation here, we really need to establish right up front that Harman operates from a distinctly Marxist historical perspective.
Okay, yes, let's pause on that for a second.
Sure. He analyzes history through the lens of material production and class struggle.
And to be absolutely clear for you listening, our goal on this deep dive is not to take a side. We aren't endorsing this specific political viewpoint or, pushing any kind of ideological agenda.
Absolutely not. Our focus is purely analytical. We just want to impartially unpack the arguments Harman presents. Because regardless of your own political philosophy, his method of connecting historical dots challenges conventional wisdom in some really fascinating ways.
It really does.
He essentially argues that changes in how we make our livelihood, what Marx called the forces of production, they inevitably force changes in our social and political structures.
Which gives us a very clear mission today. We are pulling 3 core insights from this text. First, we are looking at the main arguments regarding human nature and what actually drives historical progress.
Right, the real engine of history.
Second, we are tracing the main themes of how physical, material conditions shape society. And third, we are analyzing the key undeniable events that fundamentally rerouted the trajectory of human history.
And to really get into that first point, we have to start by completely dismantling that great man theory of history you mentioned earlier.
Yes, let's do it.
Harman uses a brilliant piece of literature to do this right early in the text. He quotes Bertolt Brecht's poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads.
Oh, I have that right here. It's incredibly powerful. Let me just read a bit of it. It goes, the young Alexander conquered India. Was he alone?
Such a good line.
Caesar beat the Gauls. Did he not have even a cook with him? Philip of Spain wept when his armada went down. Was he the only one to weep?
Yeah, and it keeps going.
Frederick II won the 7 Years' War. Who else won it? Every page of victory. Who cooked the feast for the victors? Every 10 years, a great man who paid the bill.
I mean, Brecht is forcing us to look at the invisible masses there, right? The people hauling the massive limestone blocks for the pyramid.
The conscripted soldiers.
Exactly, the nameless builders of the Great Wall. The people who actively produced the material reality that the great men basically just took credit for.
So, if we accept that kings and emperors didn't independently drive history forward, it raises a massive question about the rest of us.
It does.
Why do we so easily accept the modern cynicism that humans are just naturally greedy, like that we're naturally competitive and hierarchical?
We hear it constantly, don't we? When analyzing modern problems, people say, well, capitalism is just human nature or war is just human nature.
Right. To answer that, the text says we have to rewind the clock far, far beyond the first kings or emperors. We have to examine the vast majority of our species' timeline.
Yeah, because modern humans, Homo sapiens, we've existed for over 100,000 years. And when we look at the first 95,000 of those years, the archaeological and anthropological records completely shatter our modern assumptions about inherent selfishness.
Harman pushes back hard against a specific wave of 20th century pop science here, doesn't he? I mean, he names names.
He definitely does. He directly challenges the sociobiological narratives that became, culturally dominant in the latter half of the 20th century.
Like what, specifically?
You see this in books like Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape or Robert Ardrey's concept of the killer imperative.
Oh, the killer imperative. Sounds intense.
Right. And also the broader interpretations of Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. These writers really popularized the idea that humans are biologically hardwired for selfishness.
Like, we inherited an innate drive for dominance and violent competition from our primate ancestors.
Exactly. It's that Flintstones caricature of early humanity. The assumption that our ancestors were constantly, clubbing each other over the head for a piece of mammoth meat.
And that civilization is basically just a thin veneer over our natural brutality.
But Harman points out that if you look at actual human evolution, that hyper-competitive model makes absolutely no material sense.
Why not?
Well, millions of years ago, our hominid ancestors adapted to bipedalism, walking upright. Think about the massive biological disadvantage this created in a hostile environment.
I mean, walking upright exposes your soft underbelly to predators, for one.
Exactly. We lack thick fur for warmth, we don't have large fangs or claws for defense, and we certainly don't have the leg structure to outrun a specialized predator like a large cat.
So genetically speaking, an isolated early human was an incredibly easy meal.
A walking snack. So if we were slow, weak, and physically vulnerable, how did we survive long enough to populate the globe?
Through absolute, inescapable cooperation.
Precisely. We survived by developing larger brains capable of complex communication, which allowed for collective labor. Early humans had to work in synchronized groups to scavenge, to frighten off predators, and eventually to hunt.
So the evolutionary premium wasn't placed on the most aggressive, dominating individual.
No, it was placed on the group that could communicate and cooperate most effectively. If you couldn't cooperate, you were isolated. And if you were isolated, you died.
Which means cooperation wasn't a moral choice. It wasn't some noble philosophical stance. It was quite literally our primary survival technology.
And this necessity created the social structure that anthropologist Richard Lee, whom Harman cites extensively, refers to as primitive communism.
Okay, break that down for us. What does primitive communism actually look like?
Well, modern anthropology confirms that early foraging societies, so hunter-gatherers, they lived in small, kin-based bands of roughly 30 to 40 people.
Pretty small groups.
Very small. And their core institutions were built on the collective ownership of resources, generalized reciprocity, and fiercely egalitarian political relations.
Okay, let me push back on this idyllic picture for a second.
Here, go ahead.
If these early humans were so perfectly egalitarian, why do anthropologists consistently find evidence of violent trauma on ancient human skeletons? I mean, it wasn't all just peaceful berry picking. There had to be intergroup conflict.
Oh, that's a really crucial distinction to make. Harman doesn't argue that early humans were completely devoid of interpersonal violence.
Okay, so they did fight.
There were absolutely skirmishes, murders of passion, territorial clashes. The distinction he's making is between sporadic interpersonal violence and systemic organized oppression.
I see.
You didn't have a formalized class of people whose entire existence was dedicated to subjugating another class.
Yeah.
And the egalitarianism within the band wasn't because they were morally superior to us. It was a strict material necessity dictated by their nomadic lifestyle.
Because they had to carry everything they owned.
Exactly. If you are constantly moving to track seasonal food sources, there is absolutely no concept of accumulating private wealth. You can literally only own what you can physically carry on your back.
So hoarding food or resources doesn't make you wealthy.
No, it makes you a literal burden on the group's mobility.
Think of it like being on a remote wilderness expedition with a small team today. If one person decides to secretly hoard the emergency medical supplies or, like, the water purifier, the entire team's survival is compromised.
Right. Generosity in that scenario isn't charity. It is your only insurance policy against disaster.
It was a highly sophisticated reciprocal insurance policy. I mean, in these foraging bands, the gatherers, who were predominantly women, right?
Yes, mostly women.
They provided the most reliable, consistent source of daily calories through roots, nuts, and foraging.
While the hunters, predominantly men, provided highly valued protein. But hunting is inherently unreliable. The hunters only survived their unsuccessful days because the gatherers shared their daily yield.
And the gatherers received vital nutrients because the hunters shared their kills. It was a totally interdependent economy.
It was. But, human ego still existed back then, which is why the cultural mechanisms they evolved to maintain this equality are so fascinating. You mentioned the Khum people of the Kalahari earlier.
Yeah, Harman talks about Richard Lee's field studies of the Khum.
Right, and they illustrate this perfectly. They are fiercely egalitarian, and they actively use social engineering, specifically humor and mockery, to enforce it.
How does that work in practice?
Well, if a hunter makes a significant kill, there's a natural human tendency toward arrogance, right?
Not brag.
Exactly. To prevent this, the rest of the band deliberately mocks the hunter. They insult the meat, claiming it's too small, too tough, practically all bone. Yeah, they intentionally cut his ego down to size to prevent anyone from developing the notion that they are a chief or a ruler who deserves special privileges.
So they culturally engineered their society to prevent the exact kind of wealth worship that we build our modern societies around.
Precisely. Harman also brings up a 17th century account from a Jesuit missionary in Canada that highlights this exact culture clash.
Oh, right, the Montagnier people.
Yes, the missionary was observing them, and he was profoundly shocked by their social dynamics. He wrote back to Europe, stating that the two tyrants of European society, ambition and avarice, or greed, simply did not exist among them.
That must have broken his brain a little bit.
It really did. He noted with genuine confusion that not a single one of them had given themselves to the devil to acquire wealth.
Because wealth, as a European missionary understood it, was completely meaningless there. Status in a foraging society comes from what you provide to others, not what you withhold from them. But let me challenge the timeline here, though. If this system of generalized reciprocity was so successful that it sustained us for 95% of our history, what physically breaks that system?
That is the big question.
Societies don't just spontaneously abandon an effective survival strategy. Did someone just invent a fence one day and declare, hey, I own this land?
No, the concept of private property wasn't just an intellectual invention out of nowhere. The material conditions of the planet shifted radically.
Okay, so what happened?
Specifically, the global climate changed, forcing humanity into the first massive turning point in our history, the Neolithic Revolution, or the dawn of agriculture.
So we're talking roughly 10,000 years ago.
Yes. And to understand why we started farming, we have to look at the conditions immediately preceding it. At the end of the last ice age, in regions like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the climate became incredibly warm and forgiving.
It was an era of unprecedented natural abundance.
Right. It really was. Wild grains and animal herds were so plentiful that some bands of foragers actually settled down into permanent villages without even needing to farm.
Wait, they settled down but didn't farm?
Right. They could harvest enough wild, naturally occurring grain in 3 weeks to feed a family for an entire year.
3 weeks of work for a year's worth of food. If you're listening to this while grinding out a 40-hour work week just to pay rent, that ratio sounds like a literal utopia.
It does. They enjoy the low-stress workload of foragers combined with the physical comforts of settled village life. They built stone dwellings, invented pottery to store their massive wild grain surpluses, and they really thrived.
Well, then...
But then, the climate shifted again. A period of cooling and drying known as the Younger Dryas hit.
And the abundance just disappeared.
The wild herds migrated away, the naturally occurring wild grains withered. Suddenly, these settled, thriving villages were staring down catastrophic starvation.
So they are faced with an impossible choice. Basically, abandon their stone homes and pottery to return to a harsh nomadic life in a worsening climate, or figure out how to force the immediate environment to produce food.
And because they had accumulated thousands of years of botanical knowledge as gatherers, they understood how seeds germinated.
Right.
Driven by the immediate threat of famine, they began selectively planting the most fruitful seeds in the most fertile soil. They began penning up the most docile animals to ensure a steady meat supply.
So they invented agriculture to survive a climate crisis.
Exactly. But this adaptation fundamentally altered human social relations forever.
Because the moment you plant a crop, your relationship to the land becomes fixed. You can't just walk away from a wheat field. You have to weed it, protect it from pests, water it, and eventually harvest it.
We become tethered to the geography. And settling down triggers a profound demographic shift, particularly concerning human reproduction, which Harman highlights as a major turning point.
The connection between the invention of farming and the sudden explosion of the human population is something we rarely think about. Walk us through the mechanics of that.
Well, in a nomadic foraging band, women physically had to space out their pregnancies. A mother can realistically only carry one infant at a time while trekking long distances across varied terrain.
That makes sense.
Consequently, births were naturally or culturally spaced out every 3 to 4 years. But once a society transitions to settled agricultural villages, that mobility constraint disappears entirely.
You aren't trekking across the savannah anymore. The child is relatively safe in a localized village.
Furthermore, the economic value of children changes drastically. In a foraging band, a child is a dependent who consumes calories but cannot meaningfully contribute to hunting or complex gathering for many years.
But on a farm.
Exactly. In an agricultural society, a young child can perform highly repetitive, simple labor almost immediately. Pulling weeds, scaring off birds, carrying water. Children transform from a mobility liability into a vital economic asset.
Consequently, birth rates climbed.
Rapidly. The human population, which had remained relatively stable for tens of thousands of years, roughly quadrupled over the next 2 millennia.
Okay, so we have permanent settlements, we have the beginnings of agriculture, and we have booming populations. But does this immediately create the stark class divides we associate with ancient history? Are there kings and peasants at this stage?
Not initially, no. These early farming communities, often categorized as horticultural societies because they relied on simple hand tools like hoes, were still largely egalitarian.
Okay.
They still distributed resources through complex kinship networks. However, this is the era where we see the very first whispers of social differentiation. We see the emergence of figures that anthropologists call big men.
But if I'm understanding the text correctly, these big men weren't rulers sitting on thrones issuing decrees.
Far from it. Their social prestige was still entirely dependent on the old hunter-gatherer logic of extreme generosity. To become a prominent figure, you had to demonstrate an unparalleled ability to give wealth away.
Harman provides a striking example of this, right?
Yes, using the Musama people of New Guinea. For a man to achieve leadership status there, he had to physically work harder than anyone else in the community.
Wait, the leader worked the hardest.
Yes. He had to cultivate the largest gardens, specifically so he could maintain massive stockpiles of food to redistribute during feasts or times of need. It was culturally noted that the leader's hands were never free from earth and his forehead continually dripped with sweat.
That completely inverts our modern concept of leadership and wealth.
Yeah.
Today, massive wealth usually correlates with being insulated from physical labor.
Right.
In this transitional period, the leader is essentially the hardest working public servant in the village, busting his back in the dirt just to give away his harvest.
It was a system that maximized agricultural output while maintaining the social safety net.
But that observation leads us to the next critical question. If early farming remained relatively cooperative and leaders were basically exhausted public servants, how do we make the jump to standing armies, formalized slavery, and despotic emperors?
How do we get from a hardworking guy sharing yams in a village to a pharaoh commanding tens of thousands of people to build a limestone pyramid?
Exactly. That's a massive leap.
To understand that leap, we have to examine what the archaeologist Gordon Childe famously termed the urban revolution. This takes place roughly 5,000 years ago in regions like Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley.
And once again, it is a transformation forced by material limitations, right?
Yes, because the population boom we just talked about finally hit a ceiling.
They just couldn't grow enough food the old way.
Right. Simple hoe farming, relying entirely on human muscle and natural rainfall, was sufficient for small villages. But as those villages swelled into larger settlements, they became incredibly vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what?
Well, a localized drought, a devastating flood, or an unexpected frost could wipe out the harvest. And with a larger population, the resulting famine would be catastrophic. To survive, these societies required a massive upgrade in their forces of production.
So we're talking about the invention of the heavy ox-drawn plow and the construction of massive irrigation networks, literally reshaping the geography to channel river water onto dry land.
Exactly. But consider the material reality of building a sprawling irrigation system. A single family or even a small village cannot dig a canal that stretches for miles.
No, that's impossible.
It requires the synchronized, cooperative labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals over an extended period. And when you have thousands of people engaged in complex, multi-stage labor, you necessitate a coordinating body.
Someone has to plan the routes, manage the labor schedules, distribute the rations.
You need administrators.
Right.
And crucially, these new technologies were wildly successful. They allowed societies to produce a massive agricultural surplus. For the first time in human history, a society could consistently grow significantly more food than its population needed for immediate survival.
And this surplus had to be gathered, protected, and stored in large central granaries to serve as insurance against future crop failures. Think about what this means for you listening. We are watching the birth of the very first municipal safety net. But Harman argues that this exact safety net is where the trap of class society finally snaps shut.
It is the defining material shift that creates institutional inequality. Because whoever controls the central granary inevitably controls the society.
That makes sense.
The individuals tasked with managing these massive storehouses, calculating the grain, directing its storage, deciding who receives rations during a drought, they gradually became the most indispensable figures in the community. Over centuries, as the surplus grew, these granaries evolved architecturally and socially. They became the first temples.
And the administrators managing the spreadsheets became the first priests.
Initially, they were performing a vital, life-saving service. But because their role required them to manage the surplus rather than physically produce it, they were gradually freed from the backbreaking labor of the field.
So they stopped farming.
They stopped farming, and they began to command the labor of others. Artisans and craftsmen concentrated around the temples to build them, to weave fine clothes for the priests, to manufacture tools. The village grew into a town, the town into a city.
And the temple administrators slowly morphed from public servants into a distinct ruling class that exerted power over the society.
Exactly. And this transition gives us one of the most sobering details in Harman's text regarding the invention of writing.
Oh, this part blew my mind. We tend to romanticize the origins of the written word. We picture ancient poets, philosophers, or historians recording the human experience.
But writing wasn't invented to capture poetry.
No, it was invented by these exact temple administrators in Mesopotamia strictly as a tool for bureaucratic accounting.
They needed a reliable system to track the vast, complex incomings and outgoings of the temple granaries, as well as the labor they were commanding. Human memory was no longer sufficient.
So they began making standardized marks on clay tablets.
And when we translate the earliest cuneiform tablets from around 3000 BC, the reality of this new class society is starkly laid bare.
Yeah, you have the standard ledger symbols for bushels of grain, for sheep, for cattle, but nestled right alongside them, treated with the exact same bureaucratic detachment, are symbols for slave girl and male slave.
The texts chillingly refer to enslaved men as the blind ones, indicating they were frequently blinded to prevent escape and utilized purely for grueling manual labor like gardening and hauling water.
It's just horrific.
In a relatively brief historical window, humanity transitioned from fiercely egalitarian foragers to an urban society where human beings are literally categorized as property on a priest's spreadsheet.
It's as if the manager of your local municipal water supply slowly morphed into a high priest, built a walled fortress around the reservoir, and then used the water to hire a private militia, eventually enslaving the surrounding neighborhoods. The community's lifeline is weaponized into a tool of absolute control.
That's a perfect analogy.
But here's where a skeptical listener has to wonder. Why didn't they just walk away? If you are a peasant farmer and the priests start demanding exorbitant taxes and using slaves, why not just pack up and leave the city?
Because leaving was a death sentence.
Really?
Yeah, the environment outside the irrigated river valleys was incredibly harsh, often arid deserts or unforgiving wilderness. The peasants' entire livelihood, their very ability to grow food, was totally dependent on the irrigation infrastructure and the heavy plows controlled by the temple.
So they were trapped.
They didn't consciously vote to be subjugated, they were caught in a slow-moving material trap. The new agricultural tools required centralized organization. But once that organization crystallized into a state, complete with a monopoly on violence, through armed soldiers and enforced by bureaucrats, the trap snapped shut.
Which brings us to the profound societal costs of this urban revolution. Harman makes it very clear that the advent of civilization brought about some of the most systemic oppressions in our species' history.
It did.
Let's look specifically at the impact on women, because this era represents a catastrophic shift. Friedrich Engels famously termed this period the world historic defeat of the female sex.
It is a profound and devastating transformation. As we established, in foraging societies, women provided the bulk of daily calories, ensuring equal social standing. Even during the early hoe farming era, cultivation was a shared physical endeavor.
Right, everyone was chipping in.
But the introduction of the heavy ox-drawn plow fundamentally altered the material reality of labor.
Is that simply because the heavy plow required more brute upper body strength to manage the oxen?
Strength was a factor, but the far more critical issue was compatibility with human reproduction. Think about it. A woman carrying a nursing infant can realistically participate in gathering, foraging, or light hoeing. But physically maneuvering a heavy wooden plow, wrangling a team of oxen, and managing an infant simultaneously is practically impossible.
It's just too dangerous and physically demanding.
Exactly. The physical demands of the new primary technology pushed women out of the main sphere of agricultural production.
And tying this back to our earlier point, these settled, intensive farming societies required a continuous influx of new labor. So women were increasingly pressured into a relentless cycle of pregnancy and child-rearing to produce the workforce.
Yes, women were systematically relegated to the domestic sphere. In a society where economic value and political power are intrinsically linked to who produces the surplus and who operates the primary forces of production, women's status plummeted.
They became economically dependent on men.
This is the material origin of patriarchy. It wasn't a sudden, unexplainable shift in male psychology. It was a fundamental reorganization of the physical realities of survival that structurally disadvantaged women.
If I'm understanding this Marxist framework we're using, this is where the clash between the forces of production and the relations of production really takes center stage.
Yes, exactly.
Think of the forces as the engine of a car. The plows, the irrigation, the labor itself. And the relations are the transmission. The social rules dictating who owns the land and who gets the harvest.
Right.
Initially, having priests act as the transmission helped the engine run smoothly. But eventually, the transmission stops working for the engine, right?
That is an excellent analogy. Initially, the temple administrators spurred production. They organized the irrigation that saved populations from famine. But over generations, this ruling class became entirely detached from the actual labor.
They stopped helping.
They transformed from organizers into parasites. Their demands for elite luxury, for standing armies, and particularly for massive monumental architecture, like the pyramids in Egypt or the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, required extracting ever-increasing amounts of surplus from an already exhausted peasantry.
So they stopped building better farming tools and started pouring society's wealth into giant dead monuments to their own glory.
Gordon Childe points out a staggering historical fact here. The millennia preceding the urban revolution witnessed an explosion of human ingenuity. The invention of the sail, the wheel, the plow, metallurgy, writing.
So much progress.
But for nearly 2,000 years after the firm establishment of these great Bronze Age empires, there was almost zero fundamental technological innovation in how average people lived or farmed.
Wow, 2,000 years of stagnation.
The ruling class had no incentive to innovate. If they wanted more wealth, they just squeezed the peasants harder.
But mathematically, you can't squeeze blood from a stone forever.
No, you can't. And that brutal extraction is precisely what caused the cyclical, catastrophic collapse of these ancient empires. The elites pushed the society's resources to the absolute breaking point.
And then what?
Consequently, when a minor ecological shift occurred, perhaps the Nile floods were a few inches lower than usual for a decade, or rainfall patterns shifted slightly, the system possessed zero resilience.
The buffer was gone.
Exactly. The overexploited peasants starved, disease ran rampant, and the massive imperial superstructures collapsed entirely under their own weight.
Harman refers to these periods as the first Dark Ages. We're talking about events that often get romanticized as great historical mysteries, right? The sudden, total abandonment of the massive Mayan cities in Mesoamerica, the collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom, the sudden fall of the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley.
Yeah, we look at these jungle-covered ruins today and wonder what mystical event happened.
But they aren't mystical mysteries at all. They were the inevitable mathematical result of ruling class overexploitation leading to systemic failure, which frequently culminated in massive, violent peasant revolts.
Harman cites a truly remarkable Mesopotamian edict dating back to 2500 BC, which is incredibly early in written history, by the way.
What does it say?
It explicitly describes priests overcharging the poor for basic burials, legally seizing the community's land, and literally stealing wood from the dwellings of the humble.
So the concept of class conflict, the wealthy using the legal system to exploit the poor, and the poor fiercely resenting it, has literally been recorded since the dawn of the written word.
It really has.
But wait, these civilizations were architectural and mathematical powerhouses. They mapped the stars with incredible precision. They engineered monuments that stand millennia later. If they hit a hard limit with food production, why wouldn't those same brilliant engineers just invent better farming tools to increase the harvest?
That brings us to a fascinating material contradiction that transitions us into the next major era. Yes, these were the great Bronze Age empires. They possessed bronze and copper. But we have to look at the physical properties of those metals.
Okay.
Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Both ores are relatively rare and require massive, complex, long-distance trade networks to acquire. Furthermore, as a metal, bronze is relatively soft.
Which means it is fundamentally useless for agriculture.
Exactly. If you craft a bronze axe to fell a forest or a bronze plowshare to till rocky, dense soil, it will blunt and deform incredibly quickly.
Ah, I see.
Because it was rare, expensive, and soft, bronze was almost exclusively hoarded by the elite. It was utilized to forge shiny, prestige weapons for the king's guards or intricate jewelry and ceremonial ornaments for the priesthood.
While the average peasant, the person actually producing the food that sustained the entire empire, was still farming using tools made of stone, wood, or bone.
Exactly. The great technological marvel of the Bronze Age did absolutely nothing to liberate the masses or increase daily food production.
That shifts the entire perspective. The elites are fighting with bronze swords, while the people feeding them are essentially still using Neolithic rock tools.
Precisely. For humanity to break through that hard technological ceiling, they required a material that was cheap, incredibly durable, and universally abundant. And that breakthrough brings us to iron.
The dawn of the Iron Age.
Sometime around 2000 BC, likely originating in the Armenian mountains and later discovered independently in parts of Africa, humanity cracked the code of smelting iron.
And iron is everywhere, right?
Iron is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. It is practically everywhere, but it requires significantly higher furnace temperatures to smelt than copper, necessitating the invention of tools like the bellows. Once they mastered that heat, it changed the geopolitical map of the world.
Because suddenly strong metal isn't just an elite luxury restricted to the royal court.
It becomes a tool of the masses. For the first time in human history, the average agricultural worker could access durable metal tools. An iron axe can clear a dense old-growth forest with relative ease, opening up vast new tracts of land.
And an iron-tipped plow can tear through heavy, rich, clay-based soils that a wooden or stone plow couldn't even scratch.
Yes, and perhaps most dangerously for the ruling class, an iron sword in the hands of a conscripted peasant can shatter the expensive bronze armor of an elite imperial soldier.
Oh, wow. So it radically democratized both agriculture and warfare simultaneously.
It really did. And this technological democratization sparked a massive wave of new, vibrant civilizations. We witnessed the sudden rise of the Greek city-states, the early Vedic societies in India, the Zhou dynasty in China.
And crucially, these new dynamic societies emerged on the periphery of the old Bronze Age empires.
Because they weren't bogged down by the massive conservative, deeply entrenched bureaucracies of places like Egypt or Babylon, they had the flexibility to innovate,
They were agile. They didn't have a 1,000-year-old entrenched priesthood threatening to execute anyone who suggested a new irrigation technique.
Right.
I have to question the broader logic here, though. If being on the periphery, being somewhat backward, is an advantage, how does that explain the modern era?
What do you mean?
Well, Harman makes a highly controversial argument about why Europe eventually conquered the globe, spawned the Industrial Revolution, and established global capitalism. During the Middle Ages, Europe was highly fragmented, locked in localized feudal disputes, lacking the centralized imperial infrastructure of the East.
Oh, that's true.
China had massive treasure fleets. The Islamic Middle East was pioneering advanced mathematics and medicine. How does Europe's lack of organization translate into global domination?
Harman tackles this by utilizing a concept of historical leapfrogging, which is deeply informed by geographical material realities, drawing on theories similar to Jared Diamond's work.
Oh.
Let's look at the physical map.
Up to looking at the map.
Eurasia possesses an east-west continental axis. This means that massive climate zones stretch horizontally across the landmass. If a new crop is domesticated in China or a new agricultural technique is invented, it can travel across that same latitude all the way to Western Europe because the environmental conditions are relatively similar.
Interesting.
Conversely, Africa possesses a north-south axis, aggressively interrupted by the massive Sahara Desert and dense equatorial jungles, which severely physically hindered the spread of agricultural technology.
So geographically, Europe is positioned at the far western receiving end of this giant Eurasian conveyor belt of technology.
Yes. Now, let's look at the political structures. The great, magnificent empires of China and the Middle East were incredibly successful at managing their agrarian economies. Right. But precisely because they were so successful, they developed massive, highly centralized imperial bureaucracies. When a new, wealthy merchant class began to rise in Chinese port cities, or when potentially disruptive labor-saving technologies were introduced, the centralized state often actively smothered them.
Because they threaten the status quo.
Exactly. Their primary directive was to protect the stability of the feudal status quo. They prioritized societal order over disruptive innovation.
They viewed a powerful, independent merchant class as a threat to the emperor's absolute authority.
But Europe, during the medieval period, possessed no such massive central empire. It was thoroughly fragmented into hundreds of warring, relatively weak kingdoms, principalities, and independent city-states.
So when the game-changing technologies from the East finally filtered across the continent to Europe, innovations like the magnetic compass, gunpowder, and the printing press, there was no all-powerful, unified imperial authority capable of banning them.
Exactly. So they reaped all the benefits of the advanced Eastern technology without any of the stifling bureaucratic baggage holding them back. They literally leapfrogged the very empires that invented the tools.
That makes a lot of sense.
This highly fragmented political environment allowed a new, aggressive class to gain a foothold in the independent towns and ports. The bourgeoisie, the early merchant capitalists. They utilized this borrowed technology to aggressively break out of the European continent. And this brings us directly to Christopher Columbus.
The Voyage of 1492. Harman really takes a sledgehammer to the traditional romanticized Columbus narrative that most of us learned, doesn't he?
He does, because placing Columbus in this material context destroys the myth of the solitary, uniquely brilliant Western genius operating in a vacuum.
Columbus was armed to the teeth with the culmination of Eurasian technological diffusion.
Yes, he navigated using Arab astrolabes, Chinese magnetic compasses, and lateen sails developed in the Indian Ocean. He sailed west and collided with the Americas. But what immediately followed wasn't a noble scientific discovery. It was a campaign of brutal, systematic subjugation.
And the ideological narrative constructed to justify that subjugation is incredibly dark. Harman points out that when Columbus arrived, he encountered the Taino people, who were remarkably peaceful and hospitable.
But almost immediately, Columbus began circulating claims to his Spanish backers about other savage tribes in the region, the Caribs, who he claimed were cannibals.
It's a textbook example of narrative weaponization. As Harman and modern anthropologists note, there is zero credible historical or archaeological evidence that these indigenous groups practiced cannibalism.
Columbus himself never even set foot on an island inhabited by the so-called Caribs.
But the myth of the bloodthirsty, subhuman cannibal served a vital, intensely material economic purpose. It provided the moral and legal justification for the Spanish to use their steel swords and gunpowder to slaughter the indigenous populations.
Exactly. Aggressively expropriate their land and force the survivors into brutal slavery to mine gold and silver.
Harman argues that this specific myth of the cannibal savage was so effective that it persisted well into the 20th century to justify European colonialism across the entire globe.
It became the dark ideological foundation of the new global economic order, because the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe wasn't merely a peaceful evolution funded by clever merchants trading nutmeg and silk.
It required massive primitive accumulation.
Yes, it was paid for in blood by the transatlantic slave trade, the systematic genocide of indigenous Americans, and the violent enclosure movements back in Europe.
What were the enclosure movements?
That's where peasants were forcibly kicked off their ancestral farming lands to make way for profitable sheep pastures, driving them into the cities to become destitute wage laborers.
It highlights such a staggering structural hypocrisy. You have the dawn of the Enlightenment occurring in Europe. You have brilliant philosophers sitting in Parisian coffee houses writing elegant treatises about the inherent equal rights of man, the social contract, and the profound beauty of human liberty.
All while stirring their coffee with sugar harvested by enslaved Africans on Caribbean death plantations.
It's sickening.
The unprecedented wealth that provided them with the leisure time to sit and philosophize about liberty was physically extracted through the most brutal industrialized system of human commodification in history. The grand proclamations of the rights of man implicitly and often explicitly excluded anyone who wasn't a white European property owner.
So the birth of capitalism in the Industrial Revolution wasn't just a few clever British guys tinkering with the steam engines in a workshop. It was a massive, bloody, global collision.
It was.
It relied on borrowed Eastern technology, the violent exploitation of the Americas and Africa, and the aggressive overthrow of the old feudal lords. But as capitalism enriched the West and technological progress accelerated, didn't political thinkers eventually start to believe that we had finally solved history?
Yeah, absolutely.
That the engine and the transmission were finally in perfect, eternal alignment.
And that perfectly sets up the final section of Harman's analysis, the 20th century, and the great persistent illusion of the end of history.
Yes, Harman reserves some of his sharpest critique for writers like Francis Fukuyama. For context, in the early 1990s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Fukuyama wrote a hugely influential essay claiming that the ultimate triumph of Western liberal free market capitalism marked the literal end of history.
The core argument was essentially, we have found the final perfect mechanism for human society, and there will be no more massive ideological struggles or fundamental changes to how we govern ourselves.
Harman intellectually eviscerates this idea. He calls it fundamentally, mathematically, historically illiterate.
Think about the massive timeline we have mapped out today. Modern humans have existed for over 100,000 years. Capitalism, as a distinct way of organizing a national economy based on wage labor and capital accumulation, is perhaps 300 to 400 years old.
That's nothing.
As a truly integrated global system touching every continent, it is barely 150 years old.
Which, if you run the math, is less than half of 1% of the total lifespan of our species.
Precisely. To look at a socioeconomic system that has existed for less than 0.5% of human history and declare this is it, this is the eternal pinnacle, nothing fundamental will ever change again, it willfully ignores the entire rhythmic pattern of the past 100,000 years.
Every single social system we've discussed, primitive communism, early horticulture, ancient despotic empires, feudalism, they all arose due to very specific material conditions, thrived for a time, and eventually collapsed when those conditions changed or internal contradictions tore them apart.
Why would capitalism, a system built on infinite growth on a planet with finite resources, be magically immune to the laws of historical change?
Calling capitalism the end of history is like watching a football game, and at the end of the first quarter, one team scores a touchdown, and you just declare the game over forever.
Great analogy.
We have 99.5% of human history aggressively demonstrating that the game fundamentally changes every single time the underlying material technology changes.
It is an act of supreme historical arrogance. Furthermore, Harman points out that the 20th century, the century of capitalism's absolute, undisputed global triumph, violently contradicted any narrative of inevitable, peaceful human progress.
Right, yes, the century witnessed immense, undeniable technological, medical, and productive progress. We cured diseases and went to the moon.
But that exact same massive industrial capacity was simultaneously turned toward the literal mechanization of human slaughter.
World War I, World War II, the Holocaust.
The invention of nuclear weapons capable of vaporizing millions of civilians in a fraction of a second. decades of devastating proxy wars, entrenched global poverty, and systemic famines in a world that produced enough food to feed everyone.
The incredible industrial machinery that theoretically could have liberated humanity from want was repeatedly systemically utilized to butcher it.
So if Fukuyama is wrong, and this is definitively not the end of history, where does Harman's framework suggest we are heading? What is the mechanism for the next phase?
To explain the current global dynamic, he relies heavily on two specific Marxist concepts, right? The difference between a class in itself versus a class for itself.
Yes.
When Harman talks about a class in itself versus a class for itself, it sounds almost like the difference between a demographic statistic and a conscious political movement.
Exactly.
Like 1 million factory workers physically exist. That's a statistical fact. But until they realize they share the same struggles, unionize, and realize they have the power to shut the factory down, they aren't acting for themselves. Is that the distinction he's making?
That is exactly the distinction. Yeah. By the late 20th century, global capitalism had completely transformed the demographic makeup of the human race. It forced billions of rural peasants off subsistence land and into rapidly expanding urban centers to work for wages.
It physically created a massive, globally interconnected working class.
They all share a similar objective economic reality. They do not own the massive forces of production. They must sell their labor to survive. They are undeniably a class in itself. As a statistical reality, they are the vast majority of humanity.
And Harman provides a stunning, tangible statistic to illustrate the scale of this shift, doesn't he?
He does. By the 1980s, the nation of South Korea alone had more industrial workers than the entire globe did when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848.
That puts the scale into terrifyingly sharp focus, South Korea alone. So the global working class is exponentially larger, more connected, and more vital to the economy than it has ever been at any point in history.
But the pivotal question of the future is whether this massive global majority will transition into a class for itself. Will they become fully conscious of their shared position, recognize their immense collective leverage, and actively organize to fight for a new, cooperative, democratic way to run the global economy?
It's the leap from merely surviving within a system to realizing that the workers, if united, are the actual engine of the system and therefore have the power to redesign it.
Harman is saying the future entirely depends on whether this massive majority wakes up to the fact that they hold the cards.
Yes. And to underscore the stakes of that awakening, he quotes the revolutionary thinker Rosa Luxemburg. Writing from a prison cell while witnessing the mechanized bloodbath of World War I, she famously framed the ultimate historical choice facing humanity as socialism or a reversion to barbarism.
Socialism or barbarism, meaning either the masses take control and organize society's vast resources cooperatively for human need, or the ruling elites will literally destroy the world, fighting each other over the remaining spoils.
Exactly. If the profound contradictions of the current system aren't resolved by a conscious reorganization from below, the ruling class will predictably pull society down around them rather than voluntarily relinquish their wealth and power.
We saw this apocalyptic logic clearly in the nuclear standoffs of the Cold War. We see it today in the continued destruction of the global climate for short-term corporate profit.
The historical precedent is stark and undeniable. When massive empires exhaust their environments and collapse, and no new organized class steps up to restructure society, you don't get a peaceful transition. You get a dark age, you get barbarism.
Bringing this massive timeline all together for you listening, if you are wondering why an ancient Mesopotamian ledger, or the hunting habits of the Kung people, matter to your modern life, to your workplace, to your understanding of the news.
It's because if this sweeping history teaches us anything, it's that the way we live right now, the incredible stress, the stark inequality, the rigid corporate ladders, the existence of billionaires alongside crushing poverty, none of it is hardwired into our biology.
The human nature of greed and brutal hierarchy was molded by very specific, temporary historical and material conditions. Just as the peaceful, sharing egalitarianism of our foraging ancestors was molded by their conditions.
We are not biologically destined to be selfish cogs in a machine.
And that leads to a final, very provocative thought to leave you with. If we look objectively at our world today, we are clearly living through another massive, seismic shift in the forces of production. Think about the rapid rise of artificial intelligence, global digital networks, biotechnology, and advanced robotics.
Yeah, the landscape is shifting under our feet.
If human nature is fundamentally a product of our history and how we make our livelihoods, What kind of human nature are we actively molding right now with these new technologies?
That is the question.
Will AI and automation simply be controlled by a tiny ruling class to extract even more surplus from the rest of us, rendering millions economically obsolete and plunging us into a high-tech, modern dark age?
Or will the globally connected working class recognize their shared reality, take democratic control of these incredible new tools, and use them to finally return to the cooperative, egalitarian spirit that defined the first 95% of our existence?
The material conditions of our world are changing rapidly. The next chapter of human history is entirely up for grabs.
A high-tech return to primitive communism or a dystopian cyberpunk dark age. The tools themselves are neutral. The outcome entirely depends on who controls them. Next time you look at a history textbook, just remember, the pages haven't stopped turning, and the people who actually build and operate the world are the ones who ultimately have the power to decide how the story ends. Keep questioning the narrative you've been handed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.